Welcome everybody to the Mellon Centre of British Art at the Courtauld. I'm Professor Steve Edwards and I'm the director of the centre. The centre runs regular events, talks like the one tonight, conferences, symposia and other events, and we're generously supported by the Manton Foundation. So thank you all for coming. Tonight's talk is by Mark Crinson. Mark is an independent scholar now for last year, an emeritus professor of architectural history from Birkbeck University, which is where I know him from. It's not actually true, I know him since the 1980s. But we worked together at Birkbeck for a while. Mark has been recipient of the Spiro Kostoff Award and the British Art Book Award, and between 2018 and 2020, he served as the president of the European Architectural Network. And Mark is, in my view, one of the very best contemporary architectural historians who's able to work across a wide range of fields. I mean, interestingly, I think someone who's able to work both on 19th century architecture, classic modernist architecture, and contemporary. And you can see that across his many important books, which include Modern Architecture and the End of the Empire from 2006, Empire, Building, Orientalism and Victorian Architecture of 2013, Stirling and Gowen, Architecture from Austerity to Influence of 2012, Rebuilding Babel, Internationalism and Architecture 2017, and the wonderful Shock City, Image and Architecture in Industrial Manchester of 2022. He's just finished a study of Heathrow, from which tonight's presentation is drawn. So before the book comes out, this is going to be a kind of preview of that work. The talk, as you can see tonight, is Aviationland, Heathrow and the Making of an Airport Landscape. Join me in welcoming Professor Mark Crinson.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Steve. There have been rumours that this is a book launch. I was told by Steve in the quarter that it cannot be a book launch, so it's not a book launch. The other reason why it's not a book launch is because there's no book to launch, which would help. Yes, it's not due out until June, but you can see the cover. There's the cover of the book, and I'm sure you'll want to buy it. It's only £40. Anyway, what I want to do today is really give two talks. One is a kind of sketchy overview of some of the issues and some of the decisions I made in writing the book. And then a more formal paper in which I'll kind of zoom in on one chapter mainly. There'll be little bits from another chapter from the book to give you a sense of that kind of texture of the study. Aviationland is the title, and I'm very happy with the title. It's a kind of invention, if you like. It's a bit like Metroland, and there are a number of other lands going around in the culture at the moment. But I think Aviationland, if it catches on, then I will be expecting to be credited for it. Although my son had a little bit of a say in that as well. And what that title does is to establish that this is not just a book about Heathrow. So it's not an institutional history of Heathrow. And it's certainly not a kind of architectural history of its buildings. And it doesn't attempt to equally discuss all the significant buildings that you could find within the airport's perimeter. It is not a survey at all. It is actually about Heathrow and about its hinterland. So it's probably as much about landscape as it is about anything else, although it is about lots of things. I wanted, right at the beginning, I came to a decision that really my personal long acquaintance with Heathrow and the area around it, needed in a sense to be put to one side. And I came to a conclusion that I'd never felt in the time that I grew up around there, which is actually that this area is very important to our contemporary world. It's as necessary, in a sense, to our world as the great industrial cities, the oil fields, mining districts, container docks, or financial centres. And it is amazing that, we don't actually think of it as being a kind of landscape continuum. Of course, most of our experience of it is simply arriving there and leaving there. And we, generally speaking, don't pay much attention to the surroundings, especially if we do pay attention to the immediate surroundings of the terminals, for instance. We don't pay much attention, I suspect, to the landscapes that we see from aircraft as we come and go from Heathrow. You see, I'm not just talking about an international airport. I'm talking about a locality, and I think that tension between what an international airport does, it helps create what we call globalism or globalization, and what that airport does to a particular place, it fundamentally reshapes it. That tension is what I'm interested in throughout the book. So just to give you a few images, these are directly from the book, because the book is more or less ready to go in terms of printing it. A few images of the surrounds and the kind of landscapes that I'm interested in, as much as the infrastructures, the roads, the parking problems. This book has a lot about parking in it, which I didn't really plan, but it kind of has to be. Obviously the terminal buildings, the warehouses around the airport, and so on and so forth. And a lot of studies of, some in-depth studies of particular sites around the airport, as well as particular sites and buildings within it. There is a kind of motif, if you like. I wanted as many pictures as I could that had an airplane in the sky. I think you've probably already seen about 3. And because this first talk is going to be very sketchy, I thought I'd better put up the list of the contents so that you don't think that I'm so scatty. The book is so scatty, as I'm sure I will present it as being this first talk. Anyway, it is structured largely on a chronological and thematic basis, but one thing I know that the chapter titles are a little bit, someone said to me they're gnomic. I said, well, they're enticing. I think they're enticing. But what they do is there are 4 chapters that are inside the perimeter, as it were, and 4 chapters that are outside. So there is a structure, and now I'm going to be a bit looser. My materials are very diverse. This is just to give you a sampling of them. Film, photography, landscape itself and representations of landscape, architecture, infrastructure, maps. There's quite a lot on maps here, and I hope I'm not using the maps as evidence of something. I'm using this as equally as representations as I am of films or any other medium. And there's no priority among these different kinds of materials. And I don't really care what discipline you call this, although because it's being published by the Mellon Centre, of course it will be regarded as a kind of architectural history. There are many other things in it. It's also, I had this with Shock City. A few people said that's a bit oblique, isn't it? And I've had that word being used of this book too. And I'm not very sure whether to embrace it and say, yes, I'm all for obliquity, or to deny it and say what you do is oblique. Yeah. And I think I prefer the latter, actually. What I certainly didn't want to do, I think I've said this already, is a kind of greatest hits of Heathrow. I really did want to come at it from a number of different angles, and if some of them are unexpected, then that's great. Because this is an area of some very unexpected things. This is a map from 1958, and it shows you, I mean, this kind of Ordnance Survey map is geared to represent infrastructure. So it's not surprising that it's dominated by road systems and rivers and reservoirs, railways a little, and of course with Heathrow in the middle. So it looks like a landscape totally enmeshed in these kinds of infrastructures. And, you know, what we call this area, I think, is what we call this type of area is part of the problem, because of course we have these areas in many different places around the world. We call them things like edgelands, technopoles. Abercrombie called this the green belt ring, which didn't really catch on, although of course green belt was already being used. I actually prefer the French-derived term peri-urban, because it's a little bit more neutral, rather than edgeland, which has a certain kind of cachet at the moment, or still. But these are also, this area has also been a very important place of industrial production. And so there's quite a lot about industry in this book. It was kind of a leading place of industrial production, of new kinds of industrial production from the 1920s, when the Slough Industrial Estate, beautiful Slough, was set up. You can see on the top right there, as a planned kind of built all at once industrial estate, whose buildings were let out to companies. But the area also has those kind of linear or bypassed modern factories. And it also became the area in which really Margaret Thatcher's flagship form of industrial production, the business park, was particularly Stockley Business Park, and then Bedfont Lakes, north and south of Heathrow, were both set up there. So it is very much, since the 1920s, an area of new workplace models. And they need to play a strong role in the book as well. I hope they have done. The attempt of the book is very much to reconnect what I see as two broken halves, or torn halves, which is, as I've said before, the locality, the landscape of this area, and its role in globalization. In other words, the airport and its hinterland. And the question of this relationship between the two, which is the relationship between shifting notions of locality and totality, this is what guides the book. So I guess it's important to establish what I think an international airport is, or where I would put the emphasis. And my definition that I used earlier in the book is this one. It's a gathering in one place of labour, infrastructure, architecture and technologies in a landscape transformed for the purpose of airplane travel. So in a sense, I put airplane travel at the end of that definition. In this way, I think if we put it this way, then locality comes into this, and it plays a role which is both something which is irrefutably there, which has to be imposed upon or left over as a surplus to the airport, and something which also has a generic quality. In other words, the localities of all international airports, or most of them. I mean, I actually had the idea for this book when I was in a bus travelling from Naples Airport, looking at the landscape around the airport and thinking, gosh, this does remind me of Heathrow. Those common global conditions are also local conditions. And there are two, to go with these, there are two kind of principles. One, in a sense, I've already talked about, which is the idea that the physical barrier, a perimeter, should not be a kind of analytical barrier, conceptual barrier. You know, with that, we need to understand what goes on both sides of a fence, a wall, or a barrier of some kind. We need to understand what goes on inside and outside the perimeter, because we need to see the influence of both sides on the other side, or one side on the other side. And we need to understand the impact of an airport like Heathrow on its surrounding area, not just its obvious things in a sense like warehousing and roads and car parks and fuel depots and residential areas expanding to provide labour, but also things like pollution. One chapter is about noise pollution. I could have written a chapter, I guess, I think it would have been a lot harder, about aerial pollution as well. But aerial pollution's effects are not quite so physical as I found noise pollution's effects to be. So this chapter on noise pollution centres particularly on this school on the top left here, but it also encompasses things like noise. The idea of the noise contour map was actually developed at this time, and this is one of Heathrow. That school on the left was actually, this is what I could do with a pointer, but if you like, it was in the densest contours to the bottom right of Heathrow, of the layout of Heathrow. That's where that school was built, and it was built after Heathrow was in place. And on the bottom right, a primary school, which predates Heathrow and still stands. The school on the top left was pulled down within 15 years because it just couldn't deal with the noise. And in the middle there, that odd little structure is a gift from Heathrow to that primary school on the right. There's an interesting story about philanthropy there, which is something that I was also interested in Shock City too. Another guiding principle, so not just inside and outside a barrier, but another guiding principle was within and beyond a temporal frame. I mean, I think architectural historians often they like their dates. The illusion of start and end dates is very important, has been very important to the discipline, a kind of tethering of the objects we study to history. And instead, I wanted to understand the shape and form of this object, this landscape, let's say, and its effects and meanings as having a deeper historical causes beyond Heathrow's start date, which really should be put at 1944. And in fact, I leap over the 19th century largely and have a whole chapter on the 18th century, because I think that, as you'll see soon, I'll talk about it, the 18th century is really important in terms of ownership patterns in the area and establishing new uses, and the generally held despisal of the area, of its flatness, the idea that it could not possibly have genius loci. We'll get back to that. So flatness is really important to the book. In this map of Middlesex, which was really a kind of call to arms to get rid of the last remaining common wastelands in the county. See, the largest area of common wasteland is that diagonal one on the bottom left, which stretches from the Thames to the north and west. A huge area known today, but it's tiny today compared to then, as Hounslow Heath. And that grey area was the object of John Middleton and other agricultural reformers in terms of enclosure. But before I get to enclosure, I just wanted to quote a little bit about flatness as the primary datum of the area. I mean, it rises 1 foot in 1,000 feet. And it's extraordinarily flat. And it was very gravelly as well. In this area, the flatness of the land, the Middlesex Plain, is the primary datum. But while this levelness was one essential condition to build an airport over the old village of Heathrow and much of the old Hounslow Heath, it is also a feature that's provoked a number of reactions, from aesthetic shunning or evasion, to an object of economic gain, to something to absorb into broader regional and national planning, even to see it as a site for active land moulding or terraforming, in order to remake it. In each, that characteristic flatness is understood as something without genius, even without loci or a sense of place, encouraging political calculation about treating the local as subsidiary to larger entities, larger interests, regional, national, even global. And flatness has had several other valences. First, the dullness, and even not necessarily contradicting this, the sinister qualities accorded to Hounslow Heath. Highwaymen, travellers, unkempt people who could not be controlled. Sinister qualities. Second, flatness as a quality of what became prime agricultural land. Third, flatness as essential to the ground infrastructure supporting the economy and culture of mass aviation. And finally, flatness as something latent, just waiting to be remade as part of the political calculus of regeneration. Overall, then, there is a continuing transhistorical sense that flat lands can be imposed on, that they have no cultural capital, they are inferior, that what happens on them is less significant. And so flatness is exploitable. It deserves no inherent respect. When not ignored, it can be primped, remodelled, subject to vast intervention, geometrically imposed upon. So this area, Hounslow Heath, this vast area of flat heath, which was common land and wasteland as well, was kind of ringed by, I don't know if you can read at the back, but ringed largely in the 18th century by a set of country houses and villas, many of which, of course, are still there. And in terms of my story, one of the most important is the house that Alexander Pope lived in, because, of course, there's also a lot in this area, and I don't think we've quite realised it. There's a lot of landscape theory developing, and it's developing almost by turning its back on Hounslow Heath. Yeah? It's as if these people like Pope writes about genius loci as if it isn't at the back of his garden. Because actually the back of his garden was only 200 metres from the southern edge of Hounslow Heath. Hounslow Heath had no genius loci Pope's Garden has it. Why should that be? And of course, at the same time, these country houses and villas are also, many of them, have an eye on this heathland to acquire it in order to remake it into productive, economically productive in their terms, land. So really there are three enclosures in my story, and this is the first one, and it happens with, in terms of enclosure acts, sudden speed at the end of the 18th century in terms of Heathrow. By the 1820s, it has almost all been enclosed, and many of the great farmers are now, many of the great landowners who owned those houses around the edges of the heath, particularly say the Percys in Syon House, own the new enclosed land. So three enclosures also structure the narrative I give. The second one actually is to do with Heathrow itself and the, as it were, nationalisation of the land in order to make Heathrow. And what I've done here is to put up a map that in acquiring the land for Heathrow was produced, and it shows every landowner, and it also, in the notes for it, shows how much each patch of land will cost to acquire. And what I do in the book is I do some comparison with this Enclosure Act map from 1819 of the same area and show that the pattern of land is more or less the same as it was in 1819, but it's just about to be wiped out, and a tabula rasa is about to be created with the airport. So that is my second enclosure, and it's about nationalisation. It's nationalisation, as it were, blighted by secrecy, wartime secrecy, and then immediate post-war secrecy, and something I call the military proxy, which is the pretense that in developing Heathrow as an airport, the government were actually going to provide a military airport to serve the Far Eastern campaign, because they could see that the Western campaign was coming to an end. They knew that that wasn't the case, that it was simply laying the runways down that could then be developed for London's new airport. And there's no doubt about that. This is a kind of enclosure then, and it's enclosure that also relates to modernism in interesting ways. The emphasis in many of the schemes is on movement, and this is what I'll talk about in my more detailed paper. It's about the relationship between infrastructure and architecture, and it's about the relation between humans and machines. And again, all of those I'll talk about in a moment. The third enclosure is privatisation in the 1980s. And the airport itself in 1986 was sold off. This was the same year as British Telecom and British Gas. British Airways itself followed in the following year. And one of the, I think, signs of this, expressions of this, is high-tech, the high-tech terminal. And this is how I talk about Terminal 5. And another sign is what happens immediately, well not immediately, but quite near on the north and south of the airport with the development of business parks, which involves huge schemes for terraforming. So that, we've gone to high-tech here. And then business parks. This is Stockley Park, and I'm showing you some of the rubbish that had to be kind of taken out and transported and remade into kind of hills. So flatness becomes something to be transformed in this third enclosure. High tech is a kind of, there are also kind of two cultural expressions that go along with this. They're closely tied to the airport and its hinterland. One is what I call techno-futurism, which is celebratory, There's a myth of progress, benevolent progress, and high tech goes along with that, together with nationalism within a globalizing world, and an abandonment of the environment. The 80s is when really the airport doesn't so much literally turn its back, but seals itself in from its surroundings because the pollution of its surroundings has become so unbearable that actually, although these buildings are glazed, they don't open out. Terminal 5 is a great kind of window onto its surroundings, but it never breathes. The other side, the other cultural expression, I think, of this moment is loss of effect, or what Frederick Jameson called the waning of effect. And that was particularly embodied in the writing of J.G. Ballard. It's both a cultural mood and a style of lack of expression, of repetition, of surfaces without depths. So these are two kind of common frameworks within which that period has been understood, and I wanted to set my work quite apart from them. Okay. I'm going to go on to this more formal paper. Anthropocenic, by the way, is a term you won't find very much, but it's, I hope, developing. It means a kind of environments in which the human and the machine come into clash together. The machine is a threat to the human. In one of the opening frames of the British feature film Out of the Clouds from 1955, we see a man belted into a plane seat. The title of the book he holds is prominent, The Control of Water. This is Bill, and he is a Jewish American hydrologist heading to Israel via London Heathrow Airport. The image gives a human-faced technical aid, here in the form of hydraulic expertise and manpower for the 7-year-old state of Israel. The politics of infrastructure is thus potent. There is much to this imagined scene, shot in the studio, of course, that we now take for granted. A ramifying set of support structures that enable what is going on fictionally, but nevertheless bearing a close relationship to what actually goes on in the air, but that now we see as context aspects at best. It is these our focus on in this paper, but that potency will be returned to at the end of the paper. Bill travels in a civil aviation plane adapted from the technologies of wartime bombers. Its hold is filled with passengers' luggage, and the workers who operate the plane are both front and back of house, in the pilot's cabin and in the service or care work of other flight crew, as well as beyond them in ground control, radar, operation, emergency and security work, and so on. The plane travels to and from international airports whose numbers and locations, as well as the flight paths between them, were all agreed under the terms of the 1944 Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation. The plane is about to land on the concrete runways at Heathrow, open 8 years before, on land requisitioned by the British government using wartime powers. The airport's immediate landscape is densely and extensively occupied by roads, railways, and reservoirs. At Heathrow, Bill will pass through the still incomplete Europa terminal building, and from there transport to a plane for Tel Aviv. Much of this all-entangling, layered, necessary, but somehow ignorable context is what we've learned to call infrastructure. And it has typical effects here. Reassurance of a clean modernity, product of war, yet promise of the dissolution of the traumas, the dissolution of its traumas through new good technologies. Enabler of a smooth globalism replacing conflict through communications and travel, superordinate reason the government by benevolent diktat. Post-war aviation was newly exemplary of a range of forms and attitudes towards infrastructure, which is really my central concern here. And in examining some of these, I will especially focus on the airport terminal, also known as the passenger handling building. This is the physical but also psychological transition zone between the anthropocenic, the machine-centered, human-hurting, and the anthropophilic, the human-centered, human-loving. Extra structure, which is my term, we'll see, is a useful coinage, I think. And I use it precisely to identify these kinds of zones in which the anthropocenic aspects of infrastructure are mediated to allow their coexistence with human activity. These other terms then are recruited also to acknowledge how problematic it is to use the term infrastructure retrospectively. Its emergence in English, vague, jargony, and technocratic as it seemed then to some, was yoked to at least three issues. First, the emergence of new technologies, especially perhaps in the field. So it emerges as a term only really in the post-war period. There's one use of it in the 1920s, but really it only really becomes commonly, more commonly used in the 1950s. So it's yoked to at least three issues. First, the emergence of new technologies, especially perhaps in the field of electronics, where the object or kit was a separate physical entity from the immaterial effects produced by it. Second, a new accelerated scale of installations and transport. And third, a new sense of urgency and inevitability as part of reconstruction, modernization, and development. Arguably, all three of these issues played into the post-war emergence of the airport into a matter of major infrastructural significance and exemplariness. But the term was still uncommon. With all the subterfuge and machinations around establishing Heathrow during and immediately after the war, for instance, there was no use of the term. In all the reams of documents produced, and I've been through a lot of them, instead, specific structures like runways and hangars are named, or the term facilities might be used. There's an interesting, a trivial but interesting incident occurred in 1946 that bears on this matter of nomenclature. This image isn't really from this, but I think it shows you a little the landscape around with some airport landing lights imposed on the farmland there. After the passing of the Civil Aviation Act in 1946, lawyers pointed to the ambiguity of phrasing that limited, quote, the installation of other apparatus upon land, pointing out that this could be taken to include farmers using tractors on land neighbouring airports, just as much as the intended aim of matters like beacons being erected. So the aim, obviously, was to stop beacons being erected because they might interfere with aircraft taking off from land. Presumably, a decade or so later, the use of infrastructure in that act, rather than apparatus, might have helped, not because it was any more precise, but on the contrary, because, as Dirk van Laak has pointed out, its very vagueness, in a sense, is useful. Its vagueness broadened the issue at the same time as it made it technocratic. But this was never an issue only about things. The emergence of the concept of infrastructure also takes us to questions about the identity of the state through its territoriality, and thus about citizenship and statelessness because of the airport's status as a border site. as contemporaries recognised, the airport was a new kind of space in which, as one writer put it, our generation makes its own statement of technocracy, nationalism, and anxiety. Now, pre-war airports, I'm using Rainer Banham, pre-war airports essentially adopted the layout and positioning of the railway terminus, with runways and hangars separated and passenger handling structures placed off to the side. We could say that the anthropozemic was thus distant from the anthropophilic. Handling a new generation of bigger aircraft, as well as swelling numbers of passengers, Heathrow placed its buildings centrally, clustered around a control tower with the aircraft taxiing in to park around this hub and hangars pushed to the edges of the airfield. And that's the essential structure that we still have. Let's imagine Heathrow in its early years without terminals. Something like these images here. You enter the ex-military hubs that served as primitive passenger receiving shelters on the edge of the newly enclosed expanse. While waiting, you might pay a shilling for a brochure, taking it across the hut's rough carpeted boards to a chintz-covered armchair. The brochure's cover photograph shows a brace of propellers and the sheathed metal of an airliner posed heroically against billowing clouds. The title in its grandiose font is positioned above this on a striated blue field. The contradictions intimate what follows. The airport's transitional state is apparent with the first article. Work begins. Quote, the world's largest concrete mixer works on a, quote, the world's largest, that's the quote. The world's largest concrete mixer works on a runway. 3 other photos show concrete being spread and levelled. 2.5 million square yards were covered, you are told, with concrete 8 inches deep, 40 miles of drainage pipe laid, 2 million tonnes of earth moved. The article reminds you of something from popular magazines, perhaps like Picture Post or Life even. Its style of works documentary has the same levelling about it, a big enterprise made story-like. The second article, Airport of the Future, shows the aerial rationale behind these images of ground-hogging labour. The runways extend in great parallel and diagonal courses across the Middlesex flatlands, well secured by dotted boundaries, well served by the white lines of local roads. Next up, London Airport for the World, traces future flights across the world's continents. Its map reminiscent of those tracing imperial trading routes. Seated on your chintz, you perhaps do a bit of plane recognition, using the brochure to update a wartime hobby. You read about radio aids for pilots, about airport communication, briefing the airmen and air cargoes. Towards the back of the brochure, you meet the men and girls in labour. Sorry, not in labour, men and girls in uniform. Men and girls in uniform. And they are in labour too. So, who will serve you? Their smart and attractive appearance, notably in a still military style. You are interrupted, called to your bus to be conveyed across all that concrete. There is nothing particularly profound or memorable about the brochure. It's a marker, a token of passing a new threshold in your experience. This is the first Heathrow brochure, what you've just been looking at. And I think it's a proto-guidebook, still finding the generic form that might best work for the new mass passenger. Because suddenly, you have this huge explosion of passengers. The 50s really is the time when airplane travel becomes mass. I think this explains the guidebook's awkwardness of address and content. What should a brochure about an international airport say? After all, what it guides you to is a huge enterprise with striking geometric form, but with little coherent human experience, at least in civil aviation associated with it. So threaded through the brochure are two important but barely related themes. One might be called the logistical sublime, the other the management of behaviour. The first is about activity, sheer scale and numbers taking over the role of sublime astonishment from that of the mass or the awesomeness of nature. The second is about comportment. The first makes us admire the plenitude of the airport, even especially, I think, as it is in construction. The second takes us to the men and women who run things, their skill and knowledge, their physical attraction, their reassuringly well-kept uniforms. There are clearly contradictions and uncertainties that are not quite smoothed over, not yet resolvable. The chaos of loading baggage without beltways, the frequency of plane faults and even crashes, the sudden huge rise in passenger numbers, none of these are alluded to. And if vicarious intimacy with men and women at work on machines might not reassure us that logistical scale is really under control, then the enormity of the work and the workforce employed in building the runways is avoided by the photographs and dealt with by statistics. Clearly, the vast Soviet work schemes and Nazi labour projects were just too close as memories, I think, to risk evoking. Of these two themes, the first, the logistical sublime, is clearly more problematic in these Heathrow representations, while the second, human presence and its exemplary comportment, can be more easily, I think, idealised, emulated or fantasised. And somewhere between the two, the airport as what we now call infrastructure is yet to emerge clearly into representation. The same year as this brochure, having sorted out its runway layout, the airport authority began to develop buildings positioned in a diamond-shaped central space. You can see that there, within black, the control tower in the middle, and two buildings on the edges of that diamond. So it began to develop buildings positioned in this diamond-shaped central space of about 150 acres. The architect appointed, Frederick Gibbard, understood his work as unprecedented, with a necessarily fluid, his terms, with a necessarily fluid design brief for which, quote, no one knew the answer. I mean, in a sense that international airports across the world are trying to work out quite how to handle passengers of this kind of scale at this time. So relations between baggage, customs, people, and transport would all have to be thought afresh. His designs, therefore, are attempts to represent infrastructure and its relation to other things, not as opposed, but as interwoven. Indeed, this interweaving is a way of working out or mediating people's relation to the massively impersonal, introducing them to these machine-centered objects and buildings, and this is what I call extrastructure, this way of introducing people to these kind of more machine-centered structures, when indeed machines themselves. The terminal, the passenger handling building, was key there. In Gibbard's conception, the Europa terminal streamlined twin but inverted processes, preparing passengers for flight and processing arriving passengers. Parallel movements in opposite directions cross the depth of the big rectangular box. Departing passengers arrive in a machine, a bus or a car. Enter the larger processing machine of the terminal, then move from airside or landside along 12 parallel channels through a concourse and across the transverse zones of customs, immigration and health before reaching waiting rooms. Meanwhile, at ground level, their separated baggage moves by conveyor belt along another set of 12 channels. Bags and passengers finally arrive at another waiting machine, the plane. In its guiding, separating and processing of people and things, this is a kind of industrial process, manufacturing what we can only call the passenger product. But what did this imply about behaviour? And more than imply, how did it try to control reactions, to temper the shock of unfamiliarity? This can be distinguished, I think, from the common experience of train travel, even in major terminal stations, which might involve similar components, but usually without issues of security and customs and without systematic separation of baggage from people. In the finished Europa terminal, the dampening of noise was important to the very particular behaviour expected of the passenger. According to one guidebook, the general atmosphere is one of apparent leisureliness and quietude, an effect achieved by the suppression of echo. So apparently the marble used for the floor had no percussive resilience, while ramps were designed to be sound deadening. It's important to understand this sonic and haptic environment as part of the process or processing that is going on, and it's quite separate from the noise and pollution being created by the airport and its aircraft, from which the terminal interior will increasingly be sealed. As one guidebook puts it, despite the quiet and unhurried feel of the place, the constant human activity of travel urgent passengers is apparent in the hall. Also noteworthy are the encouragements to view, especially enhanced by a roof garden, and terraces, providing what was known as a waving base, from which the theatrics of arrival and departure might be enhanced with appropriately waved greetings or send-offs. This is part, again, of what I call extra structure. The waving base is one of those means by which the point of juncture is softened between the infrastructural airplane on its concrete runway, the building conceived as process, and the traveller. Terminal guidance models and shapes what might be called a purposeful passivity, a temporary relinquishment of agency in return for the managed distractions of a total environment. This is exemplified in an unusually ambitious guidebook of 1956, published soon after the opening of this first terminal. The guidebook gestures at temporal familiarity with its choice of artists. Gordon Cullen here provided quiet images of the central area and the outside of the new terminal, both with a nautical 30s jauntiness, as if the runways were a calm sea, and the terminal a kind of yacht club topped by the fluttering flags of other clubs. Felix Topolsky, for the same guidebook, chose the windy viewing terrace of the Queen's Building beside the Europa terminal, where his inky coils and blots made people appear like Dickensian characters visiting a seaside resort. But if the newness of the international airport as an experience was avoided by such work, this could not be said of the guide's main article, even if newness still had to be mediated with the familiar. The article, titled Passengers' Progress, and we can just imagine how a passenger might study it carefully to work out what to do, the article used a combination of graphics, drawings and photographs across six double-page spreads to convey passengers' routes through the terminal. Progress was certainly a reassuring concept, implying a stately, considered and orderly movement, even a procession, across a near ceremonious sequence of spaces, And it is this processional aspect that was conveyed by the graphics. First, the reader passenger is given the whole sequence via cutaway isometric and a photograph of a model of the terminus with a yellow line, this is not the Barbican, by the way, with a yellow line marking the route and numbered stages. Then each of the double page spreads has photographs of different spaces within the terminus. And now a dotted yellow line marks out a route across the photographs and through the following pages, from the weighing of baggage until the final arrival at a plane. The article explained the progress, of course, and in a way that was simplified and undoubtedly attractive, but in doing so, it also tried to avoid the element of agential submission or abandonment that was necessary. But the thick yellow lines were perhaps too insistent, and so in the next article, Travellers and Their Friends, readers were encouraged to relax with images of the snack bar, the restaurant, a children's playroom, etc., etc., as if to reassure them that familiar norms were still possible. I realise this is long, I'll cut it down. More direct verbal instruction to navigate the unfamiliarity of the Euro-paternal experience, the taking away of volition, was also necessary. Here is a guide from the late 1950s. So these guides are telling passengers unfamiliar with this experience just what to expect and how to behave, and that's my interest in them. I'm not going to dwell on this particular one, but they indicate what's unfamiliar and what's at stake. But I'm also puzzled by, and I think it's to do with the very newness of the experience, the inconsistency of the address, why there's often a sales pitch underlining the remarkable and the luxurious, as if passengers need luring onwards. And anyway, when the question that lurks behind this is when they would actually read these things. And here's another one. This is by the architectural critic Lionel Brett, and Brett was particularly puzzled by this. Because normally we position him on the softer side of contemporary debates about planning and architecture. I mean, he ridiculed Gibbet's approach. The passenger is a package on legs, or more accurately, a weak swimmer in a strong current of a circulation diagram. Accepted, inhaled, sucked into a backwater, ejected, swept on, tempted by well-sighted impulse sales girls, automatically sorted and counted by turnstiles, and finally disgorged into some kind of streamlined transport of which all kinds look increasingly alike. Now, I will end with this picture because it goes back to the cover of the book. But Brett's article appeared in the same pages of the July 1955 issue of the Architectural Review, the same pages as this image here, a drawing by Kenneth Brown, which seems to me to express none of the anxieties that Brett felt. We look from the second floor restaurant balcony down 2 levels through an opening created for escalators onto the ground floor. The glazed wall beyond allows us to see a landside car parking area, but also planes landing and taking off beyond that. So our scopic position here is aligned with elegantly posed flight crew further along the balcony there. And everywhere we see well-dressed passengers in ostentatiously leisurely array across the vast concourse. Dabs of bright lemon yellow pick out these airport folk, while a paler yellow outside suggests the promise of a summer's day, perhaps. Indeed, the behaviour expected could easily be transposed onto rather posh public park, I guess, or the garden of a country house. The passenger here is hardly Brett's package on legs, automatically sorted and counted. Despite escalators marking out the channels, and channels is quite an interesting term at this time, the distribution of figures across the space is anything but organised, standardised and processed. And yet, as the section overlay to one side of the drawing suggests, on the bottom right, Brown's image coexists with Brett's analysis, much as holiday-making passengers negotiated everything Brett described. Brown only shows us one end of the building, barely a quarter of its depth, and without any hint of the extraordinary movement of baggage beneath. This is what I call extrastructural space. It offers a kind of mediation, a softening or prettifying the infrastructural processes happening all around happening all around this terminus. Brett and Brown's responses cannot be resolved or chosen between. The terminal was both about happy cavorting, or at least glamorous disporting, and machinic production line processing. The cavort ornaments the function. The balance is ideally represented here, of course. The reality over the next 70 years was of a periodic unsettling, a tipping, exposing the illusion. I'm going to stop there, although I could talk about Out of the Clouds, which is a great film of the 1950s, which also deals with some of these issues. But I won't. Thank you.